Hi, everybody. Welcome to our session today, which is called Why and How to Study Chinese Now. And Now stands for Networking, Opportunities, and Worlds. My name is Bob Davis. I'm the Executive Director of International District Partnerships and Special Initiatives at the College Board. And I'm very, very excited to introduce our panel today. First, we have Dr. Shuhan Wang, who is Project Director of C.R.E.D at Asia Society and is also President of ELE Consulting International. Welcome, Dr. Wang.
谢谢. Thank you.
We also have Cleopatra Weiss, who is Director of Chinese Learning Initiatives at the Center for Global Education at Asia Society. Welcome, Cleopatra.
Thank you, Bob.
And last, we have Dr. Xinyi, who is lecturer at Chinese Language and Culture Program at the Joseph H. Lauder Institute of Management and International Studies at University of Pennsylvania. Welcome, Dr. Wu.
Hi, thank you, Bob.
So before we jump into the conversation, as we were planning this presentation, the group set out some learning goals for our audience. So I want to walk you through those quickly. Our audience will walk away with a deepened knowledge about how to increase access and equity to Chinese programs, reframe Chinese both as a global and local language, connect Chinese learning to local communities and resources, employ flexible, relevant, and up-to-date methodologies for delivering instruction and professional development, and connect Chinese learning to a range of academic and career pathways. So we have a lot to cover in an hour, but I think that we have the right group to do so. So why don't we jump right into it? So the first question I have, and this is for the group, is about the now, the networking, opportunities, and worlds. I really like this title, and I think that it's really relevant to what we want to discuss. So I was wondering, can you each describe why you feel that learning world languages, and particularly Chinese, specifically is important in 2020 and beyond? So why don't we start with Dr. Wu?
Hi, hello everyone. From my experience, I've seen more of our graduates going to China to work for the Chinese company. Sometimes, they also want to work in office in China for a multinational companies, or even want to start up, their own companies in China. So we feel, the importance of learning Chinese for these students, so they're able to communicate and connect with the local people and the local communities. And on the other hand, we also see China has rising as a power in terms of economics and the trading, and there's so many opportunities in China. And China has, made every effort to attract foreign talents, like, some of our students. So we do see it's very needed to learn this language, in 2020 or even beyond.
Great.
That's my perspective from my experience.
Yeah, thank you. Cleopatra?
Yeah, so for the younger generation, particularly Gen Z, and students who are currently in high school and middle school and elementary school, their future career is probably doesn't even exist yet. And they are more than ever going to have to compete amongst their global peers. So not just their peers in the United States or even North America. And on a global looking at the global situation, the United States is probably one of the only countries where learning a foreign language seems to be such a high barrier. In most of the world, being bilingual is very much a standard. In China, people learn English from kindergarten or first grade, and so in order to leverage and to be competitive globally, our students definitely need to learn a foreign language, and Chinese is definitely one of those languages that is becoming increasingly important in a business context, in a global context, in an international relations context. And so it's definitely a language that can be leveraged for a future career and to be more globally competitive.
I totally agree. Dr. Wang?
Yeah, I agree with what's being said by Xinyi and also Cleopatra. I like to take maybe a different perspective, from the socio-cultural, political, educational, economic, and all those different and medical perspective. Especially in light of the fact that we are all in pandemic right now, And so the need for international communication and collaboration is more urgent than ever, And so I do think that the now, the N stands for networking, and we really need to engage with more people to solve problems of this kind of magnitude. And another problem come to mind is climate change, and the opportunities, the languages take us to different opportunities, and we also have to actively seek opportunities to advance our learning and also to make out. And another thing, the W, the real world application, and has just everything about language learning in the 21st century. We can no longer afford just studying the language from the textbook and ends with textbook. It has to have real life implication, and that's going to bring the joy and pride, and also the actions that we all of us can take together. I think it's very, very important.
I totally agree with all your points. And I think I would have answered the same of each of you. So I'm going to add one different perspective, which is maybe a little less academic, but there's also just a lot of fun involved. The Chinese diaspora world is huge, right? And you can find it around the world. And there's really a rising sort of youth culture, music culture, art culture. And so I just think that there's a lot of really fun ways to connect through Chinese language that maybe people haven't thought that much about yet. But also because China itself and the Chinese speaking world is still sort of emerging, right? And so I wouldn't be surprised if the next big sort of, brand of music would be like Chinese pop, like K-pop, and people connecting that way. So there's a lot of fun opportunities out there as well as professional and academic opportunities. So stick with it, learners. Cleopatra, question for you. So this is about the opportunities, and I know this is something you're really passionate about. So in order to give students the opportunity to learn Chinese, they must have access to do so, and also have access to learning resources must be distributed in an equitable way. Can you talk about both the challenges of doing so and some effective solutions that you've seen?
Yeah, so the Age Society, we have 96 partner schools across the US in K through 12 that have Chinese language programs. And one of the first things that I did once COVID hit was to talk to some of our school leaders and ask them how they're responding to COVID and what are some of the challenges that they're facing. And one of the things that really struck out to me, and I think has become a very strong conversation amongst educators, is the fact that there is a disparity of access and in a lack of equitable access. One of our school leaders told me, quite frankly, that he was shocked because some of his students didn't have access to the internet at all. We think of the internet as being something that everyone has access to. This is the 21st century. We're living in the United States. We're a developed country. We're a first world country. So obviously everyone has the internet, but that's not the case. Not everyone has computers. And so, I think at least this conversation is being more and more addressed, and schools have found very much creative ways to deal with that. So one way that schools have found to deal with that is to you have partnerships with different corporations to provide laptops, work with some of the telecommunication companies to provide hotspots for students, and really deal with at least the access to the internet, because that's really key. The other aspect is really the opportunity part. And I'm old enough to remember the time where you had this thick Chinese language dictionary and you carried it all around with you, and you looked up words through this dictionary, because I'm pre-smartphone and all of those good tools. But now that I'm learning Spanish, I'm learning Spanish through Duolingo. Duolingo is just the app on my phone, and I just play the games a couple of times a day. And, that's how I'm learning Spanish, which is a completely different shift in how we learn languages. And I think teachers have a unique opportunity to access such a wide variety of content, not only on YouTube, but For example, I watch most of my C dramas on Netflix right now, and they have really good translations, and they have the Chinese subtitles if you want. They even have a lot of the C dramas in other translated in other languages like Spanish or Korean. And so we're really dealing with a unique access point for students to engage with language and to engage with authentic materials in that language. And I think teachers who are more successful are using those materials in order to better engage with their students and provide relevance to their students.
Absolutely. I mean, it's interesting. For so long, we've talked about how um, the teacher was the resource, right? Like we can't get teachers everywhere that there's a demand, right? And now but we always have talked. We're not always, but for the last decade or so, we've talked that technology will be the solution, right? And in many ways, it is, but only so if people have the technology still, right? And so I think that what 2020 is really showing us is that we need to be more careful about assumptions we're making about access to technology, both at schools, but more particularly in homes. It's definitely a learning moment for us. I laugh, Cleo, when you talk about your giant dictionary, though, because I remember when I was a student in China, that was like the moment when you got the big one, right? And it was expensive, and you had to carry it around, and there was no English, and it was like, oh, now I'm looking up words in Chinese. But I mean, the resources that are available now, and relevant resources that are available now to Chinese learners. I'm so jealous. My first textbook was all about Mary buying a bike so she can go to Tiananmen Square, and that was like the big thing that happened in the book. I think we've come a long way in some of these areas, but we have some ways to go.
Yeah, may I also add
Please.
some points to this topic, because I think the opportunity is so true that the pandemic exposed and hastened the disparities between different classes and areas, rural and urban areas versus suburban areas and so forth. And I do want to address another issue, that is that sort of I totally agree that digital tools and the virtual environment really open up the space, for learning. And so that will be a thread of conversation that we need to continue, because when we go back to the classroom situation, we also know and cannot sort of abandon what we have learned through this experience, in the virtual and digital, and how do we continue that to add to the face-to-face classroom learning. I think that's going to be really helpful and fruitful for that matter. And one issue is that we do notice that among teachers and students, they might suffer some kind of a fatigue as well, and so the social emotional care and the social emotional dimensions of teachers as well as the students need to be addressed, and we need to pay more attention to those issues as well. Yeah.
For sure. That's a great point. It's such
Yeah.
a, y'all, please.
Yeah,
Yes, Dr.
yeah.
Wu.
May I also add example to that?
Yeah.
The one of the challenges we face as a teacher, teaching online courses is the time zones. In the summertime when we have students in different parts of the world, we find really difficult to find a common time that everybody is awake and energetic to take our class. So we have to be really accommodating. We have some students who still work in China, but they decide to, come back and, pursue a graduate degree, but there's in China. What can we do? So we all have to wake up very early in the morning to, to make that, time difference, a 12 hours difference. So I think, like Shuhan said earlier, it's very important to address this issue of, the fatigue for both teachers and students. We don't want to see students, still sleepy when taking a language course, but in a traditional classroom, that's not a problem. But this is a problem right now that, we still have to discuss, even in, for spring or for next semester, we're still doing online courses. We're still facing, those issues. Yeah, so I think, that's the example. I think it's really, echo Shuhan's point on that.
Thank you for mentioning that. And if I may just take a moment to give a shout out to all the teachers who are just doing such amazing things in this time. I mean, it's really remarkable to see what everybody's doing, and also to the students who are proving to be incredibly resilient. It's just, I think it's incredibly inspirational. So thank you to Dr. Wu and to all the other teachers out there who are making this work. And I wonder if there, as we talked about, we might learn some wonderful best practices and see some new learners. I mean, there may be an emerging type of student who's called a digital learner who learns best in this environment, right? Who prefers it, and then others do not. So I think it's just, beyond sort of the sadness of the time, there's some really interesting lessons to be learned. I want to move to this idea of world language and local language, right? So a big part of making a world language a local language is connecting learning to local communities and resources. So what can we do? How can we reframe Chinese as both a global and local language? I'm going to open it up to anyone who wants to answer.
Maybe I'll take the first step, and
Great.
then everybody else can chime in. I think for every world language, we really have to think about that, Spanish, French, or whatever, because there are local communities that are using the language, and again, when we talk about world languages, we tend to think about the world, and of course, that is the case. For example, Chinese is a global language. It's the largest it's a language with the largest number of native speakers, in the world, and also has many countries and regions using it, as an official language. But there are also a substantial number of Chinese diaspora in different parts of the world, as well as different learners in different parts of the world. I remember last year, my husband was doing his international scientific volunteer project in Kenya in the safari, and a lot of local people came to him and tried to engage, in Chinese. And so it is a global language, but it's also a very local language, And another thing is that, again, I want to go a little bit to the, sort of thinking about educational reform in this time. And I do feel that it's too narrow to approach language learning just purely from educational learning a language or from the economic utility. Chinese was hot in the over the past 10 years or so because people viewed it as a ticket to jobs in the future, And what the fact is that China has the longest uninterrupted civilization in the world. It has so many neighbors and so forth. But when we look at the US social studies curriculum, we know China is probably just one chapter in sixth grade and then maybe in eighth or ninth grade, So we really need to take a hard look at our curriculum and really to try to figure out how can we teach the world in the 21st century context, to our students through our language, English language arts, and also social studies, science, and all the different curricula area. I think that's a very important approach that we need to think about. And another thing is that, China, and I think a lot of Chinese teachers feel pretty confused and perplexed about how to deal with the different, different sort of framing about Chinese language and China. And particularly in some areas, they were being accused to teach a communist language. And the fact is that we really need to understand better in order to have critical ability to assess, what is real information versus fake information, and to form our own opinions and perspectives about about the world and about how we can move on and really engage in world peace and health and prosperity together. I think that's really the most important sort of mission in language learning and teaching.
Mhm. Absolutely.
Yeah, I'd love to echo Shuhan's point. You know, I think we need to break this narrative that students must go to China in order to speak Chinese, because it's really a false narrative, and a lot of other languages don't have that same narrative. So, for example, I am learning Spanish. One of the reasons that I'm learning Spanish is because, well, A, I'm from Florida, and I do feel a little weird that I don't speak Spanish, and I'm from Florida, but also because, you know, in my day to day life living in New York, you know, there are a lot of Spanish speaking people, and I happen to like to engage with people and to talk with people. And I just assume, like, you know what, if I wear my turban and I speak Spanish, maybe someone will think I'm Dominican and I'll have a great time. Right. So, you know, I think it's that narrative that we need to push much more in terms of, you know, engaging with local communities. So I'll give an example that echoes Shuhan's point about Kenya. My husband's from West Africa, and we fly to West Africa mostly every year to see, you know, his family and, you know, visit my mother-in-law and have a great time. And the first time I went to West Africa, I get on the plane, and the plane is maybe I'd say 60% from West Africa, and maybe 30%, you know, people who are Chinese, of Chinese heritage, who are working in West Africa, and then 10% other, right? And as I, you know, go to, my husband's from Sierra Leone. Every time I go to Sierra Leone, I always have these amazing conversations with people from China. You know, we go to the casino and go to the beach, and you go to there's like, they don't have a Chinatown, but they have a like a Chinese compound that has like a Chinese grocery store and a few other like Chinese restaurants and things like that. And you really get this interesting sense. And having traveled a lot around the world, I always meet Chinese people, and I always have a great time conversing with them in Chinese. But in the U.S., in the U.S. itself, there are a lot of Chinese communities. So, for example, in New York, we have Flushing, which is a large Chinese community. Usually, universities have, you know, Chinese students there that are going for study. You have Chinese Saturday schools, is what you call them, are like for heritage speakers. And there seems to be such a missing link to have our students engage with those their peer students who are of the Chinese diaspora living in the United States. That's not a small amount of people. And we have to have them forge that connection. Otherwise, they think, well, if I'll never go to China, then why learn Chinese?
I totally agree. I mean, it's funny to me. Having learned Chinese in college, et cetera, there's a lot of people scratching heads in the 90s why I was doing that. But what I've actually found is that as I've grown older and I've traveled the world and been able to go to countries on almost every continent, I always can find a Chinese speaker. My wife and I went to Paris. I don't speak a lick of French, right? And people were not being particularly helpful, right? When I was trying to ask directions. And I quickly found, you know, oh, here's a shop with Chinese people working there. They were wonderful, give me directions, et cetera. So you know, Thailand, et cetera. So it is increasingly a world language, right? Because there's a world population. And that's really helpful. But I just think there's a million different ways to connect Chinese, and that we have to remember that global issues and global narratives are also local issues and local narratives, right? What impacts the world impacts us at home as well. So, you know, you can start using Chinese today in your community. I guarantee it. And as you become comfortable doing so, as you as a person expand, your ability to connect with people is going to expand as well too. And it'll be fun, it'll be exciting, it'll propel you forward. And so, you know, what starts at home will definitely bring you around the world. So sticks again to the learners, stick with it. It's quite fun.
Yeah, let me,
Yes,
well,
please. Yes.
let me add an example from a teacher's perspective. So
Great.
we recently trying to do a group project in our curriculum, which means that students will look for local NGOs or companies or any organization they're interested in to help those people do a little service. So, but the only requirement we have for students to speak Chinese only. So some of the organizations they have been engaged in include like church or YMCA, the voters organizations, and then there is the Chinese restaurants. So we really give them the opportunity to engage in the local communities, and we feel like their Chinese has improved a lot because they get to interview some Chinese people, they get to talk to the restaurant owners, they get to do a little service around the Chinatown, or they even become the customer service people or hotline the phone call people. So they help those Chinese voters who cannot speak English to vote. I feel like it's the Chinese really help our students to improve the local community, and they are really enjoying this kind of a projects. So I mean, just like Shuhan, the Cleopatra said, it's if you really engage yourself in the local community, you feel like Chinese, learning Chinese is a lot more significant than just learning the language itself.
That's right. I'm a little jealous of Dr. Wu's students. I'm just going to say that sounds like a great program to be in, honestly. So let me ask the next question, which is about also part of the now. A big part of the now is being up to date, right? Flexible and relevant, both as educators and learners. Where are we now as an educational community in this aspect? And where do you think we should be heading in this? So Shuhan, can I ask you that one?
Yeah, I think this is as I said earlier, that the pandemic really sort of advanced us by 4 years, 5 years, because like one time one colleague said, if we are going to say everybody will do virtual learning and blah blah blah, we'll probably do a lot of pilot and study and feasibility study and this and that, and now all of a sudden in March everybody just have to jump in and swim, or sink, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it really gave us sort of expand our knowledge base and the know-how, right? And there's no question about the willingness. You just have to do it, and so we do it. So I guess that is in a way the positive side of the Chinese always think about yin yang, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's a dark side, there's a bright side, and I think that in a way that's the bright side. And teachers are learning to be more flexible, and also like Xinyi was saying, more accommodating and this and that. And but of course we know that teachers also need support pedagogically, because they were not trained to teach virtually, and the whole different ways of teaching is very different. Even the materials, or how you show and use materials, will be very different. And students likewise and also need to probably have some kind of train, can benefit from some kind of learning strategies and training on how to learn effectively virtually. And also earlier everybody said how to identify, maybe use a lot of like a YouTube or shows or songs or movies, whatever it is, to add to the curriculum and the textbook, And so we all have to be more flexible. We
Yeah.
all have to kind of really open up our mindset and our willingness to try different things. One thing is so funny is that over the summer, I my family, we start having Zoom meetings, family meetings, and stuff like that. And I have 5 grandchildren, and the youngest one is 2 years old, so he's too young to study. But the others are like from 3 to 5, 6 years old. So my daughter said, hey, Popo, why don't you just give your grandchildren some online lessons to make up for what they miss? So I said, yeah, let me learn it, because that way, when I work with teachers, I know the issues and challenges that they face as well. So go figure, try to offer online courses with the 3, 4, 5, 6 years olds. And one time I remember, so it was so funny that my grandson, who's 3.5, And so I tried to get him engaged and copy, color, and do all different things. And he was kind of like, and so how do you grab him virtually, And
Mhm.
so that type of thing. And then at the end, my daughter came in and checked on him. And so I kind of say, I'm not sure Ali was so engaged. He didn't really draw pictures like what we said we would do. And my daughter said, okay, where's your paper? And then she turned around and she said, Ali, you should draw pictures on the paper, not on the wall.
Ooh, uh-oh. This is online instruction gone wrong. Yes.
Totally. But those are some kind of funny examples, and I'm sure
Yeah.
teachers have tons of stories like that. But that kind of show us that we also have to start thinking about how do we do this online learning, more flexibly and more relevant and effective. But
Right.
in terms of you know learners, and I do feel that, for example, I will stop right here. I do feel that it's also important for learners to identify some local role models,
Mhm.
or national or whoever, some role models of learners, because as we are having this conversation, Bob and Cleopatra, I think you two are great role models for a lot of students, and hopefully for our audience, in students in the audience who would think that, you learn the language, you study abroad, and you are able to find ways to use the language and your knowledge of culture professionally. And I think that's such an inspiration for students.
Well, that's very kind of you, but I
Thank
would hope they would
you.
look higher than me. I know that they could push themselves better, but thank you so much. Dr. Wu, I wanted to kind of follow up on this question though, just spontaneously to ask, because one of the things that I always wonder about is checking for learning, right? Because we do so much of that in the classroom. How has that been as a teacher in the online environment? Is it difficult to make sure that the students, to guarantee that that the students are actually learning what you hope they are?
This is one of the biggest challenge. I think it's very hard to check if they are really learning. One of the things we do is to have some online tools to have students, actively reading the articles. They can annotate, or they make a note or something about articles so everybody can see. Other things we do is do like discussion forum. We not force, we kind of force them
Mhm.
to make comments or leave any notes, on the discussion board, carry a conversation. And then, we also give them assignments, doing like, voice thread or other watching videos, something like that, trying to see if they have some products we can actually, it's tangible things we can actually see to make sure they're learning. But just like you said, it's very difficult to track. Um, we're still thinking, how we gonna, actively engage them in our conversation. I have to, most of the time, I do not talk much in Chinese. So
Mm,
I leave that time for students to participate. That way we feel like, I can check them by, having them speak Chinese.
that's
So, I feel the challenge in the traditional classroom. This is a lot easier. Either do a formative assessment or do a summative assessment is a lot easier. But now it's really difficult. We also change, the like midterm or final on the paper exam to like a writing an article instead. So
mm,
it's there's a change of that kind of assignments or assessment. So yes, definitely we're still trying to figure out different ways to assess students. Yeah, but
it sounds like it. And Cleopatra, I mean, so Cleopatra and I work closely together.
yeah.
We've worked on a National Chinese Language Conference together, but we also do an online professional learning series, right? That's related to NCLC. So I was wondering, Cleo, if you could talk a little bit about how you've had to pivot, you and your team this year, to make sure that you're still engaging teachers and providing the great resources that you do.
Yeah, so we all know COVID has been just like this single most, or at least the biggest disruptor for K through 12 education, at least in recent history. And as COVID kind of started to happen, we've been on the phone talking to our teachers, talking to our school leaders within our network, and talking to our partner organizations like the College Board, and that's why Bob and I have such a great rapport. And one of the things that we found is that obviously during March, this was kind of a do or die moment. There was no runway, no way to plan. It was just like, let's survive and figure this out together. And so the expectations weren't that high, but moving really into the fall, it was time to really excel in the online learning space. And, we've been talking to our teachers within our network, and there's a realization now that with the rising COVID cases, even some of our partner schools that migrated back to a hybrid model now have to switch back to online. And the spring doesn't necessarily look all that great either. And so for them, really sharing best practices and giving them a community and a platform to share best practices with each other, how to use certain tools, how are they integrating technology in their classroom, how are they dealing with parents. I think parents are a very interesting part of this conversation that in a traditional classroom doesn't get brought up very much, because parents are now co-educators with you. And that relationship has to be quite strong in order for online learning to be successful, especially in the lower grades. And high school students can very much independently learn if that's what they really want to do. But in elementary school, there's no way. I mean, I have a colleague with a 6-year old. There's no way a 6-year old is e-learning by themselves. It's not happening. And so there's kind of the two conversations. First is, how are you using technology and integrating those tools to be successful in e-learning, and making sure that we're providing that platform for them to share best practices. And two, how do you engage with parents? And I think those are the two conversations that even once we go back to the traditional model, we'll still keep having, because as Shuhan said, we basically leapfrog 5-6 years into the future. And once you leapfrog, you can't go back, right? So what comes out of COVID will be very much interesting to see.
Absolutely. And I have an 8-year-old, and I can tell you the e-learning is going hard. It's difficult, but what I'm excited about is I'm now going to enroll her in Shuhan's class, which apparently is going great. We're gonna put paper all over the walls first. We're just gonna let her be in it.
Can I also share one example?
Please.
I think that really, what Cleopatra said about the family parent connection really brought this to mind. That is, I've seen some classes, and it's just amazing in the sense of it really, as I said earlier, that it opens up the space, right? So we're not confined in the classroom. So, the kitchen could be your classroom. So a teacher was teaching how to make some Chinese food, dish. And she's using her kitchen as example. And it's like a cooking show. It was really fun. And then, the assignment for all students is cook a dish, of your family heritage or whatever you want to do. And then they have their parents, involved, and they were doing the cooking in the classroom because they are teaching sort of sequence, right? 1, 2, 3, and first you do this, and this is ingredients and whatever. And it doesn't have to be a Chinese dish, whatever the students home dish, whatever it is. It was really wonderful, and everybody loved the project. Parents loved it, and so that kind of just increased the bonding between the parents and the children, and gave the parents a more sort of deeper understanding of what's going on and what are the possibilities in the Chinese classroom. It really is a part of your life. That's the idea.
Right.
Yeah.
And that really kind of comes back to our earlier discussion about making it local. Like there's nothing more local than you're home and you're doing this, right? And now go find this and go, talk about this and what's really in your home, right? Most of our students probably don't live in a traditional Beijing hutong, right? They live in a house somewhere in America, and that's what they're going to learn. So I think it's actually sort of exciting, right? As you've all mentioned it, we've had to propel in some ways, and I think that parent involvement, they're gonna understand much better how their students are learning as well, what type of learner they are. I know that one of the conversations that often comes up in Chinese language learning in the United States is that parents feel it's difficult to support their students because they may not be Chinese speakers themselves. But now I think they're going to feel much more empowered to do so because they're going to be able to see how their own students are learning day to day. So there's some great potential here. I wanted to talk a little bit about the why, right? And so for those of you who've been involved in Chinese language education for a long time, I've been doing it now for 150 years, as you can tell. When I first got started in the late 90s, there was a lot of kind of head scratching, like why Chinese, right? I mean, this was not something that was very common. And then the 2000s happened, and it became much more of a understanding as China became a more of a global power, and they were opening up. And of course, the Beijing Olympics was a big moment where there was a big spotlight on China. Now things have shifted a little bit again, right? We are kind of bringing things a little bit home a little bit more. Resources are less, right? It's a little bit harder to get. So I was hoping we could talk a little bit, about the why. And with the growing awareness of global interconnectedness, it's become has less so. However, it's important to keep the why in the now. So why now is it important to learn? And also, what opportunities do you see emerging for learners of Chinese in both their academic and career pathways? So Dr. Wu, can I ask you to start that off? And also, could you talk a little bit about the program that you work in? Because it's such a fascinating program.
Yeah, definitely. Yes. So yeah, I want to kind of briefly talk about my program and see how we incorporate that now into our curriculum design.
Great.
So we offer a joint degree program in MBA at the Wharton Business School and MA in Arts, School of Arts and Science. So the students, when they graduate, they will have a both MBA degree and MA in international studies. The reason we have this joint degree is we believe as a global leader or business leader, they have to have some understanding of the people and the cultural in the target country. So that's the goal we want to our students to achieve in the end. But so language is a very key component of a student really understanding or connecting with the local people or local culture or communities. So when we teach, well, we not just teach the language itself, we want to teach a content about this country. So the students use the language to understand, develop their critical thinking skills, or their, understand how the business practices in China. So in our curriculum, some of the issues we address, including the social economic issues, the geopolitical issues, the social concerns, even the cultural practices, like the education, like the industrials. Technology, AI, robotics. These are some of the topics we all cover right now, but in Chinese, not in English. So we want students to have some kind of knowledge about China while they studying their professional skills in a business school, so they can link their knowledge in one school with the practices in another. So we felt that students, by engaging in this kind of a dialogues in target language, they develop their linguistics proficiency. At the same time, they can build their cultural competency. So in the future, they can become a global professional who is proficient in this country, and then can understand the people, connect with the local community, and can actually make a powerful impact in the world they choose to be. So I think this is in this sense, I think I want to say learning a language just not a language like 150 years ago, like Bob
Hmm.
would say that when he started teaching probably, but it's really about learning the knowledge about that country using the language. So I think this is the direction we're heading right now, and I think it's really important that you see how language can open that door for you, not just like Shuhan saying getting a ticket to that job, but a skill will benefit your lifetime. That's
That's
what I
really
would say.
interesting. Anyone else want to?
Yeah, sure. So, circling back to the equity issue,
Yeah.
when we visit our partner schools, there's a kind of sad trend, where in the upper middle class or rich neighborhoods, the schools with Chinese language programs are very much well supported. And the reason as to why learning Chinese is not, a difficult question. Most of the parents are saying, well, my uncle or my husband or my wife does some connection or business with China or has to fly to China throughout the year, and I want my child to be competitive and have the highest level of advantage, and Chinese is a way to do that. And therefore they put a lot of money and effort into their Chinese language programs. But when you go to rural areas, I'm personally from a rural area in Florida, and you go to lower income schools or schools within a lower income tax bracket, the reason to learn a foreign language seems to be waning. And this to me is very much an issue of equity, because for someone who is of an upper tax bracket or from a higher class family, quote unquote, their access to wealth and their access to opportunity is not going to live or die by Chinese. Whereas, someone from a lower income tax bracket, that could be the defining point for them, for their career and for their professional development. Personally, I would say learning Chinese definitely changed the trajectory of my entire life. Just to give you some context, I went to the University of Southern California for undergraduate, and that's where I learned Chinese. And the first time I actually went to China. And then after I graduated, I spent the better part of all of my 20s. So 8 years living and working in Beijing, and eventually doing my MBA at Peking University. But during that time, a lot of people ask me, like, why do you live in China? Why China? Why Chinese? And I always tell them, my time in China wasn't, what I take away from that is not necessarily about Chinese culture or Chinese language. It's about opening my mind to these new experiences with different people from all over the world. I met people from Libya, I met people from North Korea, I met people from South Korea, I met people from the African continent, I met people from Latin America, I met people from Europe, and you gain so much understanding about the world, about different cultures, about different perspectives, and you realize yourself to be very American, first of all, which is always a shock to Americans. You're like, no, I'm not that American. And then you also realize that people have a different point of view than you, and you're able to understand different world events and situations from completely different contexts. And from my career opportunities, it's definitely been a defining situation for my career. And I think even though, with US China relations being difficult, if you can use that word to sum it up, the engagement of China will not just go away. It doesn't matter the political context. China is here to say there's over 1 billion people in China. Their economic power is going to continue to grow. The United States is a world leader. So, for the younger generation who is interested in learning Chinese, this could really be or really mean for them, a certain level of competitiveness. And then from a personal standpoint, it really does help your global understanding.
And that's, that speaks to the network, right, in our now, right? I mean, it's very much that. And you talked about how when you're a student in China or anywhere, right, when you live abroad, you meet people from other countries, right? You're not just there only interacting with locals. I also studied in China and taught at a university there. And yes, there is this tendency to sort of push the foreigners together in some ways, but in the right program, you're pushed together, but you're still only speaking Chinese, right? It's a really an interesting dynamic. I have friends that I made in Beijing who, I've kept in touch with for my whole life, and just to watch what they've done with Chinese is there's such a huge range of ways they've engaged Chinese plus. So I like that idea is sort of what you're doing, whatever it is you're doing, plus Chinese is going to just open your world, right? Because it just means you can do what you're doing in twice as many opportunities than you would if you just did it in a monolingual way. So it's really exciting. I'm as excited now as I was as a young learner. Actually, I feel like there's probably just a lot more opportunities, and the why becomes clearer, but the why continues to evolve like everything else, right? Um, so it's very exciting. What other sort of networking opportunities do we see, or what other networks are we seeing for learners of Chinese?
Yeah, I'll take this question as
Yeah.
well. It's interesting when you're outside of a community, you don't tend to know much about it, right? So, as someone who lived in China for 8 years, who speaks Chinese, my husband and I, when we were thinking about where we were going to go, it was time for us to leave China, and we were thinking about going back to the United States. I was like, well, which city should we go? And we were thinking about where we had, the largest community. I was like, what? I know a lot of people in New York. And when we moved, and my husband also knows a lot of people in New York as well. And so when we moved to New York, a lot of my other friends that I met in New York was like, Cleo, did you ever live in New York before? I was like, no. They were like, you didn't go to school in New York? I was like, I went to school in LA. They're like, how do you know all these people in New York? I'm like, oh, I know them from China. And they're like, but your husband also knows all these people. Oh, he knows them from China too. And it's just like very funny to have those types of communities of people who shared a similar experience as you have, right? So most of my friends are returning. We call them expats. So returnees back to the U.S. from China that I know from Beijing. And just speaking on, what you mentioned, Bob, about the kind of opportunities. When I first went to China for study abroad, well, actually, it was the second time I went to China for a study abroad. It was during the financial crisis, and so most of my class was college students, but then there was this other group of students that got fired from like Lehman Brothers and Goldman Sachs and had 10 years on Wall Street, and was just like, what, China's a fun place and it's cheap. At that time it was really cheap. It was cheap, so let me just like hang out in China and learn Chinese. Like, that's something to do. And so I had all these friends like that. And then when I graduated from university and I came back, they were still in China. I was like, what are you doing in China? They're like, oh, we all got job offers because they had 10 years in Wall Street and China didn't get as hard hit by the financial crisis. And now they're all back in the US because they had 10 years of Wall Street and then had significant experience in Chinese financial markets. And now that's in Chinese language, and now they're in the US, and so they're like, making multi-million dollars. But that's besides the point. Is there's so much opportunity despite what industry you're in, and then there's this whole community of people that are attached to that community. And just like any other community, that community is fostered, and it's a good networking opportunity. So for example, we have like a WhatsApp group that's specific to people who lived in China. There's also one that is specific to people who lived in Beijing, who live in New York. That's like enough of amount of people that have a whole community on WhatsApp, and we talk to each other, and people are like, oh, I need this, or I need that, or do you know this person doing this? And it fosters a lot of connections, and we have meetups. Well, not so much now because of COVID. But I just think that it is a community that, if you learn Chinese, and especially if you end up living in China as an expat, you will definitely be a part of.
Yeah. It's funny. I just saw my brother-in-law recently. He's a big gamer, and he was saying, "I wish I could speak Chinese because like 75% of what's going on in the gaming world is in Chinese, and he's like, I just feel like I'm missing out. So, yeah, Shuhan, and we have about 5 minutes left, so I want to be mindful.
Exactly, and I just want to kind of add a few more points that have not been talked about, and probably more to the why question and also the networking question. In addition to the social, cultural, or the wonderful benefits that we talk about, and cognitively, being bilingual has brain research have shown that bilinguals have advantages, that they are better in executive function and so forth. But there are two other points I really want to make. One is that I feel that the now is also for career technical education. We really need to introduce more Chinese and other world languages into the career technical education arena, because there are so much need for servicing people speaking different languages, in the hospital, in the hospitality, in the like an electrician or plumbing, construction, you name it. We need to emphasize that, and so that the job opportunities for students coming out of those programs will also be broadened. And another very important point of why we need to study Chinese and another world language is really through the study of other language and people. You get to know your own language and people better. And that's such an important point that it's like a white elephant in the room that we don't recognize it, we don't think about it. But when you're saying that you need to say it this way, and they're holding on to their dear English like their lifeline, right? And it's really and when you go abroad to communicate with people in the language, people are not going to say, hey, tell me about how much do you know about how Chinese people celebrate Chinese New Year. They will say, what is the biggest holiday in America and how do you celebrate it, and then you have to really know why you celebrate it, how you celebrate it, and all the different things, so that you can be an ambassador to other people. And that is how you engage other people as well. And I think that is a point that we really need to emphasize. You really get to know your language and your own culture, your own value system much, much better. And that is so important.
Absolutely. Well, listen, we've come to an end. This hour went by so quickly. I feel we could probably talk for another hour, but I want to thank each of you for being in part of this conversation. I could not be more pleased to be here now with all of you and to be part of this field. And I also want to thank you for all that each of you have done to contribute to this field and continue to do so. I'm very proud to be colleagues with you and friends, and I hope that this presentation will be useful and inspiring to our audience. And I look forward to doing it again in the future and seeing in a couple of years where we are now then, and how we can continue to propel Chinese language education, both in the United States and across the world. So thank you, everyone, and happy Thanksgiving. We're recording this right around Thanksgiving, and we'll talk to you soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob.
谢谢.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.